This video is sponsored by DistroKid. Mixing bass can be complicated, especially when it comes to getting low frequencies to translate across different listening devices. If you've ever played back a track on a smaller listening device like a laptop or a cell phone speaker, you might have noticed that the bass is not as impactful as it is on a bigger sound system. This is because bass primarily consists of low frequencies, which are often felt more so than they are heard. These frequencies need room to manifest and a playback system that can accurately reproduce them. Unfortunately, this isn't always the case in the real world, especially considering that a lot of consumers are listening to music on earbuds or small speakers in particular. And even if you have access to big monitors and a subwoofer like I do, you may notice that you still need room to be able to hear the bass in a mix. I've noticed this myself. If I'm sitting close to a set of speakers like I am now, the bass is not going to be nearly as impactful as it is standing at the back of the room, such as where my mix assistant Piper is currently lying down. Now, a common mistake that a lot of people make when mixing bass in particular is they'll reach for an additive EQ and start cranking it, adding a bunch of gain to lower frequencies, thinking that it's going to help it cut more across these different listening situations I've mentioned. Unfortunately, usually the opposite is true. While adding low frequencies can definitely sound pleasing at first, doing so can often lead to a muddy mix that is less articulate and not any better than where you first started. Even worse, boosting low end will eat up headroom on your track, making you more likely to clip and leading to other potential gain staging issues that you might have to deal with later. But what if I told you there was a better way to enhance your bass while avoiding the pitfalls that I've just mentioned? Enter two plugins from Waves, Renaissance Bass and MaxxBass. In this video, we're going to explore both of these plugins, demonstrate how they work, and I'm ultimately going to show you how I would use them in a mix to enhance my bass sounds in particular. But one thing that I do want to make clear, just in case the title of this video confused anybody, I'm not suggesting that you abandon EQing bass altogether. EQ is still very useful for sculpting the tone of a track and making space between competing sounds in particular, but what I'm really proposing is reaching for these tools in place of additive EQ. Instead of going ahead and boosting certain frequencies, try these tools first, and if you still are unable to get the sound that you want, then you can go ahead and start EQing even further. And if you're interested in checking out either of these plugins, I'm going to leave a link to them down in the description below. You can do a free trial, you can purchase them. The world is your oyster. You have both options. And while you're down there, feel free to tap the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already to see more mixing content like this in the future. But before we talk about these two plugins and how I would use them, let's talk about the sponsor of today's video, DistroKid. If you're an artist that puts out multiple music releases per year, you could save a lot of money and simplify your life by using DistroKid. Millions of artists, myself included, rely on DistroKid to get their music onto popular streaming platforms including Spotify, Apple Music, and more. They make getting your music onto stores a breeze with their simple interface, and they pass on 100% of the earnings generated from your music directly to you. They even make splitting a song's earnings super easy with their splits feature, great for sharing a song's revenue with featured artists, producers, and other collaborators. Other distributors make you pay every time you upload something, or they keep a percentage of your earnings, which ultimately ends up costing you more. With DistroKid, you pay a low annual subscription fee that lets you distribute unlimited music for the year, making it much more convenient and less expensive than the other guys. DistroKid also gives you access to helpful tools for content creation and marketing your release, including hyperfollow landing pages, the Visi video generator, and much more. A lot of artists I work with love using DistroKid, and I'm sure you will too. You can sign up today using my link down below to save 7% off your first year. Thank you, DistroKid, for sponsoring this video, and now, back to the content. Let's now explore how to use each of these plugins to achieve a richer sounding low end, starting with Renaissance Bass first. The way this works is every sound has a fundamental, the lowest frequency from which harmonics are generated. If it's low enough, sometimes the fundamental cannot be played back properly. A device with a small speaker, such as a cell phone for example, cannot properly reproduce the 808 bass in a rap song because the fundamental pitch is too low. Using an EQ to add more bass to the signal will just make matters worse, since it further stresses the playback system. Now, the way that RBass fits into this is it helps you preserve your original bass signal while also allowing you to add harmonics, which can increase its perceived loudness and presence on a track. A harmonic refers to a frequency that is a whole number multiple of the fundamental frequency of a sound. For example, if a note has a fundamental frequency of 250 Hz, its harmonics would include frequencies at 500, 750, 1000, and so on. The brain can reconstruct a missing fundamental from just the harmonics the ear is hearing. Your ear hears these harmonics, and then your brain can go backwards, so to speak, to recreate the fundamental. In other words, you can hear the low bass note, even though the speaker is not capable of reproducing it. It's almost like an illusion. So in my case, and for this demonstration, I'm going to apply it directly to an 808 that I have on this track that I want to just bring out a little bit more. Before we get started, I'm going to deactivate it. Let's play this track, and I'm just going to show you what the 808 sounds like before we get started.
Hey, relax. B, I'm tired, I'm taking a nap. Seen these, they say we won't last. Hey, relax. B, I'm tired, I'm taking a nap. Seen these, they say we won't last. Hey, relax.
While the bass isn't bad by any means, I feel like I can get a little bit more out of it. It just feels like it needs a little bit more weight in the low end in particular, but I also don't want to go in there with an EQ and potentially create a muddy mess by boosting frequencies, as I've mentioned. So instead, I'm going to enable and use the RBass to create an illusion of thickness. The first thing that we're going to want to do is set the fundamental frequency at the bottom here with the slider. This controls the frequency from which the Renaissance bass begins generating harmonics. A key thing to know is frequencies below this value are going to be removed from the original signal and replaced by the generated harmonics. However, you can re-add the original frequencies by using the original bass in out right here. Now, to find the fundamental frequency, we're going to want to put on an EQ like the F6 from Waves with the RTA analysis, and we're going to just play the track and pay attention to which frequency has the highest amplitude, which would indicate the main frequency that this sound is made up of. So you would have noticed, depending on which note is being played, the highest amplitude was somewhere between 32 and 42 hertz. So now we can get rid of this EQ and go back to our RBass. And I'm going to just split the difference and set the fundamental frequency between those two at 37. Now, just this alone will already start producing an effect, and I'll just quickly show you what that sounds like. However, we still have a lot more to do here. You can already hear that increase in presence, as I've mentioned. Next, we're going to use this intensity slider here to control the level of the generated harmonics. The higher the intensity value, the more generated harmonics are added to the signal. I actually like to start by reducing this to the lowest setting possible, and then playing the track and slowly increasing it until I just start to feel an increase in the presence of the bass. As we do this, we can pay attention to the created harmonics meter behind it. This is that orange type of bar that's going to be appearing in the background here, and that'll basically show the mix of the generated harmonics with the input signal, minus the original bass, assuming I deactivate this like so, which falls below the fundamental frequency. So everything below 37 right now with this out, we're not going to be hearing. We're only going to be hearing the generated harmonics, and we're going to be seeing it in the background of this slider here. So let me reduce this and play it and find a place where it sounds better. That seems to be okay. And again, we're only hearing the harmonics that this plugin is producing, and it's not really factoring in this 37 hertz or lower from our original bass signal going in. So that means we've effectively cut or removed every frequency below this level, and in their place added the harmonics instead. However, if we want, we can now re-add our original signal by enabling this in button, and that's going to reintroduce our original bass with the fundamental frequencies and lower in conjunction with the harmonics we're producing here. So for clarity, when I take it out, I'm only hearing the harmonics. When I put it in, I'm hearing the original bass, the low end and everything with the harmonics. Let me actually play this, and I'll just put it in and out, and you can hear the difference it's making. Just a lot fuller and thicker, more present, right? Again, getting the best of both worlds here with the low end for the big systems and then the harmonics for the smaller systems that are not necessarily going to hear that low end to the same degree. Of course, this is still going to benefit the big systems too. It's going to make this more pronounced, but we're effectively doing this to improve the translation onto those smaller devices as mentioned. Now, finally, we have access to a gain as well as an output meter in the background here, which is going to allow us to control the overall level of our track after it's been run through the RBass. Typically, I'm going to use this to simply match the volume of the signal that I had before, but of course, it's not necessarily going to be perfect. I'm just going to want to match this as best as I can, and I am going to use a couple of additional tools such as the WLM meter and the PAS analyzer from Waves to try to find a middle ground so that way I'm not being deceived by what we're doing here. I want to make sure I'm confirming this decision by matching the volume, and then if I choose to make it louder after the fact, I totally can, but I just want to make sure that this is actually enhancing things without just making it louder and therefore seeming better. So I'm going to quickly put in these two analyzers, and with these now set up, the PAS showcasing the RMS and the WLM showcasing the LUFS, I'm going to now be able to adjust the gain and find a place that is a little bit more comparable to where we first started before applying this process. So this level here seems to be a lot more comparable. And overall, when I bypass and put it in, the volume difference is a little less noticeable, but we're just getting that thickness and benefiting from the RBass as I mentioned. So let me get rid of these meters. Let me take this out of solo mode. Let's put it in and out of context. And let's actually hear exactly how this is sounding in the context of our whole track.
Hey, relax. I'm tired, I'm taking a nap. Seen these, they say we won't last. Hey, relax. I'm tired, I'm taking a nap. Seen these, they say we won't last. Hey, relax. I'm tired, I'm taking a nap. Seen you, they think we won't last. Hey, relax. I'm tired, I'm taking a nap. And seen these, they say we won't.
So I'm not going to lie, in context especially, it's a much more subtle difference, but I would say it's about 10% better, and that's good enough for me. You can obviously push this over the edge, go super crazy, really drive up the intensity, maybe not do the volume matching stuff that I did, and produce a much more exaggerated effect. But overall, you can hopefully hear and see how this tool is just helping the bass cut through a little bit more clearly, increasing its perceived loudness and presence on the track, but without going in with an EQ and doing a bunch of other things that could potentially create some problems. So now with RBass covered, let's shift gears and talk about the other plugin I mentioned, which is MaxxBass. Now, MaxxBass is very similar to RBass. In fact, RBass is built on the technological foundation that is MaxxBass. MaxxBass also creates harmonics around a signal being fed into it, which can trick the ear into perceiving low bass frequencies that may not actually be present in the output. However, I'd say that MaxxBass is a bit more flexible as it gives you more ways to control and fine-tune the sound, whereas RBass is a bit more similar to a one-knob type of option. It's a little bit more limited into how you can sculpt and shape the sound. That means RBass is quicker and easier to set up technically, but MaxxBass gives you a lot more flexibility, and I actually prefer it for that reason. And one key difference here is that the MaxxBass has the MaxxBass graph here, which shows you the original bass signal, and then as I increase the MaxxBass presence, you're going to see a visual representation of that as well. This MaxxBass curve is obviously the harmonics that we're going to produce via the plugin. Now, what's great about this is we can actually control the relationship between the two of them. Obviously, with RBass, you can just put the original bass in or out, and that's it. Whereas this plugin, you can actually decide how much level to assign the original bass, in addition to the level you want to assign the MaxxBass harmonics that are generated. You can also actually solo each of these by just clicking on their respective text here. I want to hear the original bass, I'll click original bass. If I want to hear just the harmonics, I can press the MaxxBass. Or I can hear the combination of the two by pressing audio. So let's actually talk about setting this up. I'm going to set everything back to their default settings. And just like the RBass, the first place we're going to start is the frequency slider here towards the bottom. This essentially controls the split point between the MaxxBass and the original bass. As you can see, as I shift it, it's going to shift exactly where these two lie. And it's going to help determine exactly where the harmonics are going to be generated. It's typically best that we set this crossover point somewhere between 50 and 90 hertz. So with that in mind, I'm going to find the fundamental frequency first so we can kind of work from there. I'm going to bypass the MaxxBass. I'm going to put in the F6 real-time analysis. I'm going to play it, and we're just going to pay attention to see exactly where the fundamental lives roughly. And if it's in that range, we'll set it there, or we're going to have to figure out a higher up area that makes sense in the context of the track. Let's check this out. So, like a lot of other tracks, it kind of floats, right? Depending on what note is being played, we're seeing a different frequency being queued up, and it ranges anywhere from, the high 30s up to the 70s, right? Now, in my case, I find that it really is floating a lot around the 64-ish area, so I think that is where I'm going to focus this next process on, as that seems to fit right in between that window of 50 and 90 that I mentioned, while also being a key place where you could see the bass being played. So I'm going to set this to 64 like so. Now, I am going to leave my original bass set to 0 here, and we're going to now actually introduce some of the harmonics via the MaxxBass process. Let's actually bring it back down. I'm going to slowly bring it up as I play this and try to find a place where I just like it, where I hear a bit of a difference, where it sounds more impactful, but of course without making it too overbearing. So right here at about minus 2.5 seems to be pretty good. Of course, we're going to adjust this a little bit more, but I'm just starting to get that emphasis from the MaxxBass harmonics that are being generated. So from here, we can now fine tune our sound by focusing on the dynamics and harmonic sections down here at the bottom of the plugin. For the harmonic section, we can select from several types of high pass curves, being 6 dB, 12 dB, and 24 decibel octaves. The higher the number, the steeper the cutoff becomes for the harmonics. And what this means is it might lead to a more focused effect the higher that you go. And that's because you can see that the harmonics are not necessarily appearing for lower frequencies as they would if I were to set a 6 dB octave, for example. See how much lower that goes? So obviously this is basically determining how focused we want the harmonics to be. I want to play this again and just audition all three so we can just hear the difference it makes on the sound. Now, 6 dB does technically sound the most musical as it is the least aggressive. It's applying the most broadly, so to speak. And 24 dB is ultimately the most focused option as it's really keeping things concentrated a little bit higher up in the frequency spectrum. However, I find 12 to be the best of both worlds, and I think that's the one that I'm ultimately going to go with. Now, moving on to the decay setting, this allows you to control the decay rate of the higher harmonics. As we increase the decay, you can see the top part of the band is moving and changing. And what that means is we're actually achieving more higher end harmonics and making them more present in the mix. When I decrease the decay, it's the opposite. It's going to produce an even more focused sound, somewhat similar to this high pass that we're talking about. So let me play this and adjust the decay rate and see how we can affect our sound in the process. It's a bit subtle, but I definitely like the increased decay time, so where I'm introducing more high-end harmonics rather than the more focused one on the other side. Of course, we could choose somewhere in the middle, but I do like this decay of -9 right now. Next, we can evaluate the dynamic section. And on this plugin, while you might think that this is a compressor, this is actually an upwards compressor. I've done a video on upward compressors in the past, and I'll link to that up above if you want to watch that after to get a better understanding of this process. Let's look at the ratio first. If we choose to increase the ratio, which caps out at 4:1, it might actually make the harmonics more pronounced, and that actually might necessitate us to go in and reduce the presence of those harmonics either with the settings we talked about before, or even reducing the overall level of the MaxxBass. However, if you want to exaggerate the presence, you may want to increase the ratio for that reason. When I have this ratio set to 1:1, which is the default setting, there's pretty much no compression taking place, and therefore the harmonics have the same dynamic character as the original bass in the mix. So let's actually play this and increase the ratio just to see what happens. It's definitely producing a bit more of a buzzy sound, and I've actually found a middle ground between 1:1, which is basically nothing happening, and 4:1, which is a lot happening. When I had it higher up, closer to 4, that buzzing type of sound was a lot more pronounced, whereas here I find I'm sort of in the middle ground of the two, and it's producing a nice smooth effect, but still an enhanced effect at the same time. Next, we have the response setting, which is essentially a combination of the attack and release that you would find on a compressor. Faster or lower times can make the harmonics respond quicker, and that'll make them sound more pronounced as well, whereas slower response times do the opposite. They can actually make the harmonics sound a bit smoother. So let's play with this setting and see how it affects the sound. So right here with a quicker response time of about 12 seems to be good for me. It's what I prefer. Obviously, when I pushed it towards that 30 number, it's a bit of a subtle change, but you can definitely hear how things are a little bit more smoothed out as the attack and release times are essentially slowing down. However, with the quicker time, I'm getting a bit of a snappier reaction, a bit of a more pronounced reaction from the harmonics. And obviously, that's part of the reason why I'm using this. I kind of want the harmonics to be generated, and I want the bass to cut through a little bit more in the process. Now, something that I haven't mentioned, and unlike RBass, is this plugin can produce some big differences in the peak levels of your track. You can actually potentially clip. You see that we're not clipping as we've been setting this up. Everything is sounding good and we're not in the red. However, if you find that you are clipping, you obviously may need to go in and balance your input to reduce it, create a little bit more headroom, or you may need to manage the original bass and the MaxxBass levels, reducing them a little bit to find a better blend between them, since we do have essentially two versions of the signal that are combining, and that makes them a lot more liable to clip. So just like before, what I'm actually going to do is just close this really quick, put in a couple of metering plugins, and I want to see how much of a difference we are achieving with this process and if I need to do any further gain manipulation. So we do have some discrepancies between these levels. And again, they're not always going to be perfect, but what I'm going to do is actually go in and play with the input and maybe the original bass level as well to try to get it closer to the level of the starting signal. So again, not 100% perfect, but a lot closer. We're really mirroring that RMS level, and we're getting pretty close on the LUFS side of things, and I've really just reduced the input by about 4 dB. That is going to slightly change the reaction here a little bit, but overall I could still hear the difference before and after. Speaking of before and after, let me take this out of solo mode. Let me get rid of these meters really quick, and let's actually play and hear how this bass line sounds in full context with and without the MaxxBass plugin. Now, it's a pretty impressive, but again, subtle difference. And I can really hear it on these in-between type of moments where the bass just feels a little bit quieter without it, but with putting this in, those notes are equally as present and powerful as the other parts. I'm not trying to go crazy here and push this to the limit like I said. I am using this in a realistic type of scenario. But of course, if you want to push it, you always have that option to do so in your own sessions when you try this out yourself. Either way, both of these tools can greatly enhance whatever you apply them to, especially low-end sounds like the kick and the bass. And speaking of the kick and bass, if you need some additional help with EQing these sounds in particular and getting them to play nice with each other, which is a very common issue, click the card you're going to see on screen to watch that video next. I break down how I approach EQing kicks and basses and getting my low end to play nice as a whole. I appreciate you guys for watching as always. If you got value out of the video, please smash that like button and subscribe if you're new to see more content in the future. I'll see you next time. Peace.
5